sentence frame is through the planning. However, with sentence frame and our Common Core and ELD standards, here's a big push with the use of sentence frames. To use sentence frame to maintain academic content, whether science, history, what have you, and language simultaneously. So when we plan for our sentence frames this week with your curricula, we want to take a look at what's the content, what are the language demands, how do you want them to interact through the use of sentence frames. I'm going to also push you a tiny further and ask you to start creating complex sentence frames. My favorite animal is because it's fantastic and rigorous for kindergarten, but we have to start there with primary grades so that we can build up and we can say there are several reasons why the panda bear is my favorite animal. First, second, third, depending on where we are with instruction. Common variable here is language frames. So when you think about sentence frames, here are three big ideas. Please write down the following purpose for sentence frame. When you think about a sentence frame, we want to initiate a conversation. When we think about sentence frames, we want to use sentence frame to mediate a conversation.
Mediate?
Mediate. And that means when we have a conversation, there are times when we're able to process through whether I'm going to clarify, I'm going to elaborate, or I'm going to respectfully disagree with you. And then ultimately to summarize the conversation. I don't think I did a good job just 2 seconds ago with the following big idea here. Sentence frames can also support syntax. Syntax meaning the structure of the conversation. Because we want to also teach students how to maintain a formal register and an informal register. Syntax plays a big role with the sentence frame. It's okay to say, dude, that was tight. Right? In a conversation. But when I write now, I want to be able to say there were 3 reasons why the author supports First, second, third. Please.
Gosh, I just feel like Kate Kinsella would argue with that when they're in school we shouldn't be doing the informal conversation, that they need to be taught academic conversation.
And I respectfully agree with you because I misspoke then. When we think about informal and formal, we want to continuously push on formal registers. We want to continuously remind students that language plays informal and formal. There are times when you want to speak informally.
On the yard?
In the yard,
Not
in the classroom. We want to make sure this is an academic stance. This is an academic sandbox. I want to make sure we maintain formal registry. However, we don't want to say we don't talk that way, we don't write that way, because we do talk that way and we do write that way, just not in this context. So where Kate Kinsella, which I truly love and support her work, one thing that we're going to work with California Common Core and ELD standards is the context when to choose that language. When is it appropriate to use dude, that's right, or cool, versus here's a formal way of saying it. Because if I'm in the playground, I can say that. But when I'm writing a persuasive essay, or if I'm in this conversation, in this academic stance, there's a way to interact. And I'm going to help you do that, but here's some frames. Anybody disagree with that statement? So here's some examples. Charlotte's Web. Anybody not familiar with Charlotte's Web? So here's the time. Remember? So I'm thinking that Fern didn't want her father, Mr. Arable, to kill the pig because she thinks it is unfair to kill an animal that is a runt. Fern shows compassion for the pig. What does Fern show? Compassion. So a question I would like to ask students to initiate is, why does Fern decide to save the pig from being killed by Mr. Arable? Fern decides to save the pig because, So I want them to use evidence from the text to respond to the following. Here's how they can mediate. Tell me more about Or, Roseanne, I'm not too sure, I don't understand. Could you say it another way, but not slower and louder? If you say it another way, then again, I think, and it's okay, this is something that, I apologize if I sound disrespectful, but I'm not. I will stand toe-to-toe with any teacher to teach kids how to disagree with one another, how to challenge one another. Because even as adults, we learn to challenge one another in a respectful way. That I'm not attacking you, but ultimately, then again, this is another way of thinking of So Common Core is going to ask students to not only question the content, question one another, but also be very respectful to question the teacher. I was in an observation and a student looked at the teacher and said, well, I respectfully disagree with you because, found some evidence, supported the answer, and the teacher said, this is another way of taking a look at the following. So when you think about it, it's initiate, mediate, and to summarize. Anybody familiar with, or not familiar with Bud Not Buddy? Bud Not Buddy is a fantastic text. Fantastic text. There's a portion where in the text, this is orphan at 5 years old, being placed in his 3rd foster home. So think about this following. Bud did not react positively when he was informed he was being placed in his 3rd foster home because he's used to the process already. He knows what's going to happen. He knows that is going to happen. So he's not happy, nor he's not sad. And actually, he's really jaded right now. Because at 5 years old, being orphaned, and you're being placed into the 3rd foster home. So a question I could ask would be, how did Bud react to the social worker when he was informed that he was placed in a foster home? What we want to practice here, ladies, I know that you might have heard this already. Take the question, form it into an actual statement. However, take a look at the following sentence frame. When Bud was informed that he was being placed in a foster home, he reacted by Most times, if we don't give that frame, students will go back into and they'll say, cause. Right? And you want to say, whoa. Because or cause? When you think about the responses, our students are not naturally trained to take the question now and restate it into a statement. That's what we'll work on this week. I'm not gonna. Oh, here. This is a very good one. Please.
Could you go back to the last slide?
Uh-huh.
So, I guess I'm a little bit unclear of the difference between the initiate, immediate, and conclude. Are you saying that these are 3 different ways to pose this question? This is the question, the initiate. I understand the initiate part, and I feel like our students come very prepared. In 5th grade, my students do not answer me with because they answer me, and I did not teach them this. They came from 4th grade, thank you, knowing, and 3rd grade, knowing they answer their sentences just like this. When Bud was informed, they would do that automatically. So could you explain the next two? I'm sorry.
Yes, I appreciate that clarification. When you think about mediate and conclude, yes, you start off with one question. The mediate could be now, once they're having a conversation, it's not another question we ask. We give frames to each students to be able to maintain that conversation.
So these are like levels then?
Not necessarily levels. Think about it as scaffolds. So let's just say that Roseanne and I are having a conversation, and as she's explained to me something, and I don't get it, to mediate, I could say, could you please help me understand that? Or please clarify. Or, you know what, if I'm hearing you say, I can paraphrase. So when you think about 3 ways to use a sentence frame, I can use the sentence frame to start the conversation, to maintain a conversation, I think that's better, to maintain a conversation, as well as to conclude a conversation. So think about it as an academic conversation. The beginning, the middle, and the end. Please.
I guess while we're on this topic, in looking at the framing that you're doing, when Bud was informed and then the answer is at the end, from the Kate Kinsella training that I received, oftentimes she adds blanks in the sentence where they need to fill in other details, and I found that for myself personally, that type of framing is not hard to do, but her framing was very challenging for me to frame properly where it was meaningful. So I guess my question is, would that be a level of her framing that was really high level? Because this to me seems more open-ended, but her frames are where the kids are encouraged to use vocabulary in their sentence. And then there's usually an open-ended part where the kids could play with it a little. But that was something that was challenging for me personally in framing, and Jeannie Oakshott, the teacher behind me, and I went to this training together, and then we tried to apply it in our peer evaluation, and I found it really hard sometimes to make good frames.
And I don't disagree with you. I think that it's very difficult to craft a very sophisticated, complex sentence frame. There's a difference between a sentence frame and a closed passage that you would add in vocabulary within a closed maze versus a sentence frame. The intent for this conversation is, as we continue with structured conversation, the power of your question. If the question requires multiple responses, then you will have a conversation to be able to mediate and to be able to conclude. But if the question is very low level, as what's the name of the character, I can tell you the name of the character, then we need to move on. So that's the focus for this piece, is when you craft your think, pair, share, your numbered heads, the types of questions we want to ask kids to maintain a conversation, the power of a sentence frame. We'll work on crafting sentence frames throughout grade level collaboration this week, because the best way to learn that is with your curriculum or with your text. Okay, so hang in there. There's one piece I want to be able to share with you. Language is all over Common Core and ELD. So let's say I want to focus on the use of progressive. I was walking. Divergent questions. The questions we ask kids, before we can get them to diverge their thinking, we need to ask those text-dependent convergent questions so they take that evidence and that information and use it as a divergent response. So the questions that we ask, we will be able to spend more time this week with planning for a think, pair, share. Once we've taught the procedures and routines, what we want to focus on is the quality of the questions. Questions, thoughts, and concerns about divergent. What's that?
No, nothing.
Depending on the grade, though. Questions that we're going to ask our students also can require us to focus on vocabulary. So when you ask questions, divergent questions, we can also ask questions for students to do a think, pair, share based on vocabulary. We can ask questions for students to base on the text we're using, on the complexity of the text, the structure of the text. How is the author informing you about beavers and doves? Well, the author is comparing and contrasting beavers and doves, or sharks and amphibians. Or, because we're reading this text, sharks. Get ready? Tell your partner, what structure do you think the author is going to inform the reader based on the title, Sharks? I've taught kids that if the title says sharks, it's going to be a description or an explanation about sharks. But if it was a title that Sharks and Amphibians, Wonders of the World, I already know, based on that language, I'm going to compare and contrast two items. Making sense? So the questions that we're asking will be very important. I'm going to do that. I am going to ask you about sentence frames. Quickly work with the partner. What do you know about sentence frames? How are they useful, or are they not useful? Get ready, go.